Is America going through a crisis? Is that the fourth turning? And what does that mean? Well, I get the idea of the fourth turning from the book, The Fourth Turning. And this is called The Fourth Turning, an American Prophecy: What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny, by William Strauss and Neil Howe. Fascinating book. If you're not someone who can really digest dry history, not the book for you, but I would still get it and read the fourth chapter, or not the fourth chapter, but the end chapters here, where it talks about fourth turnings in history and preparations and preparing for the fourth turning and things like that. Really, really fascinating, because I believe that we're living in, quote unquote, the fourth turning right now. What does this mean? These are analyzing the cycles of history, and they're talking about turnings, 4 turnings in total, breaking up what they call a saeculum. And a saeculum is an age-old term used to talk about basically like a century or a life cycle of people that basically is about 4 generations. So when you say fourth turning, you could say the 4th generation. And where do you draw that line from? Well, they look at this and they kind of draw it from these big events, all right, big crisis events, like, for instance, World War II, and then the Civil War, and the Declaration of Independence, and the American Revolution, all of that. So if you look at, and if you just take those events, those are like really big events. And why do we center around those events, that timeline? Well, if you just go back 80 to 100 years, again, that saeculum is 100 years, but over time it's been sometimes 80 years, sometimes 100, sometimes 90. So it's around 80 to 100 years. And every 80 to 100 years, we experience this big crisis and a big turning point in our society. And if you go back 80 years, you'll find World War II. If you go back 80 years from that, you'll find the Civil War. If you go back 80 years from that, the American Revolution. And this pattern goes on. Again, if you read the book, the pattern goes on and on and on, 80 years to 100 years, 80 years, 100 years, around that for, a very long time. And it's kind of talking about the Western world. So why do we get this crisis after every 80 to 100 years? Well, if you think, you have one generation born, about 20 years later, that's when most people are going to be having kids, 20 to 25 years old. People have a kid, and that's another generation. So that's generation 2. You wait another 20 to 25 years, another kid, another 20 to 25 years, another kid. And what's interesting about the first generation, or the first turning and the fourth turning, those 4 generations that go by, you can think about this for yourself. What is your relationship, or what was your relationship like with your great-grandparents? And that would be those generations, that 4th generation previous. Most people never even met their great-grandparents, or if they did, they didn't have that great of a relationship with them because they ended up dying shortly after they grew up, all right? So most people don't have the ability to communicate with them. And what's interesting about that is those people went through that crisis, and they were alive before it and during it. So they have a lot of information that we don't have. Yes, it's anecdotal. Yes, it's experiential. It's not like it's a history book, but what do we know about history books? They're through the interpretation, right? This is by William Strauss and Neil Howe. This isn't by every single person's account. It's by their research and their reading. So there's bias to it, yes. They try to be as unbiased as they can. I think they do a great job, but there still is inherent bias. Whereas if you've lived through something, you can say, this is exactly what happened. We're getting better at that with video and whatnot. But we've seen lots of different things happen especially in the Western world. Now it's happening all over the world. But even with political things going on within our country, it seems like what they mention in the book, where cycles happen, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, one of those sayings. They basically speak to that, and they talk about basically kind of predicting that, hey, we're going to have some of these crises. And this book was written in, I believe, the 90s. Let's see, 1997. So they, were talking about this stuff taking place within the next 10 to 15 years. And what do we get? We get, turmoil with Donald Trump being elected. Now we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. Is there something more that's going to be coming out later? Who knows? But it's very interesting to think about that this isn't some new phenomenon. They go back again 80 years, again another 80 years, another 80 years, and they show you in history all of these different turnings. And what's the main cause? What's the main fault? Is the things that we should have learned from our great-grandparents. Because we don't have that communication, we recreate the same sorts of things, end up with the same problems. So again, even if you're not someone who this book took me forever to read because I'm just like, I can't handle it. But the fourth turning part where they talk about that, especially because we're in it right now, is very fascinating and very, very interesting, because you get to look at some of the fourth turnings in history and kind of what led to that. It's great to understand the entire concept of the four turnings, because it gives, context of how things end up happening. But again, because we're living through what I believe is the fourth turning, and they'll probably share my same opinion, they're not all the same. But for me, this one is more similar to like a civil war versus like a world war situation like we had in the 40s. It's more like the 1860s. And even if you look at that time, like we're talking about civil war with the United States, but there were tons and tons and tons of revolutions going on all across Europe. You can look up the European revolutions of the 1840s through the 1860s. So at the same time in Europe, there were all these other revolutions. Why is that happening? Were they, dealing with the same exact issues that we weren't? No, but we're connected. People are connected all across the globe. And it's interesting to look at that and analyze why it happens and what we can do about it. Now that we have the, dissemination of information where we can send so much information out all over the place, I feel like it's our responsibility to use the information that we have to help people, help governments, help ourselves, help the world minimize the damage that it comes. Because World War II was an insane amount of damage. World War I was a lot of damage as well, but not as much. And there wasn't like this big political shift that happened after World War I. But if you look at the Civil War, tons of people died, because we were fighting each other, and there was a huge, big shift that happened. So that's why they kind of look at certain events versus others, like why not the, the Vietnam War or this or that. They explain all of that in the book, which is very fascinating. So interesting book. I believe that we're going through a massive crisis right now. Obviously, we're going through one crisis, but I think that this is something, there's deeper lines to this. And if you read this book, you'll understand a little bit more about why. So I highly recommend it, again, even if you're only going to read the chapter on the fourth turning, because the rest of it is a little bit dry, and they use a lot of big words and a lot of examples from, 90s. These guys are very, very smart, but they're using examples from when I was very young. And so I don't, quite get a ton of them, and I'm not a big history buff, but still fascinating stuff. Where do you think we're going to go? Do you think it's going to get worse? Do you think it's going to get better? Interesting read. I would recommend it, and give me your thoughts on what you think is going on in our country and around the world, and what's going to end up happening. Is it going to continue? Is it going to stop? Is something else coming around the corner? What do you think? I'll do more videos about what I think, but just wanted to recommend a great book to understand more about history.